Okay, hello. I'm Shona Hunter. I hope you're all having a good day. This is kind of strange. I'm not used to speaking to video on my own, so let's see how it goes. Um, so I just wanted to say a big kind of thanks to Maxine for inviting me and to Michael for kind of helping out with doing or kind of facilitating you guys seeing me by video. Um, so thanks for that. Thanks for the opportunity, and just to say that I'm really sorry that I can't be with you all there today or tomorrow, as it is for you. I'm recording myself the day before. And another apologies, I've got kind of a bad hay fever, so hopefully it'll stay at bay while I'm having a chat with you, kind of going through the stuff that I've got to say today. But if not, apologies for the sneezing and the tissue. Okay, then. So, how I've organised today's session is what I've done is I've done some slides for you all. I'm going to speak to those slides. I can't see them. I haven't got a slideshow running whilst I'm speaking to you, but hopefully, what I will be able to do is give you a sense of where I am in that pack of slides. So you'll have those with you hopefully tomorrow. If that's not been possible, then I am sure we'll be able to circulate them digitally somehow. Yeah, so let's see how we go. Let's see how we go. Final thing, I suppose, is I have thought of some things that you might like to discuss as a group, depending on kind of how your thoughts are going and how the conversation's going, when you've kind of finished engaging with what I've kind of got to say around the kind of topics that Maxine's invited me to speak to. So let's see how we go. Yeah. I haven't got another screen either, so you've got kind of me flicking my slides a little bit. Okay, then, so just to give you a bit of an introduction to me and my work, really. I mean, you can kind of access info about the broad range of things I do. I'm based in the Carnegie School of Education at the moment. I've kind of got quite an interesting disciplinary background, but I'm sure you're not really interested in that sort of stuff. I guess Maxine has and Michael kind of thought it would be a good idea for me to come and speak today because I've been doing work with various different men really about masculinities for kind of nearly 20 years now. So that's kind of an important aspect of my work, which has come about largely, I suppose, because I'm interested in how institutional power works. And a lot of the people who occupy power positions within our institutional spaces are still men. So that's kind of how that interest kind of started for me, I suppose. So I've been doing feminist work with men, explicitly feminist work with men, for the whole of my kind of academic career. So the kind of themes that Maxine had asked me to come and speak to you about were really broadly around whiteness, masculinity, positioning, and power, how those things work together and how they work in the context of working lives. So the approach I adopt, I'm not going to talk too much about theory. I've got some kind of ideas that will help frame the data that I'm going to think about as we move through later on in the talk. But I'm not going to kind of bombard you with lots and lots of theory. But the approach that I've been developing for all of that time now, really, is a feminist, psychosocial, kind of decolonial, anti-racist approach to working with people in positions of power and in particular formal institutional power. That approach kind of gives me a way into thinking about material practices, so money, buildings, all of those sorts of the kind of concrete, real bits of life that we think about in terms of materialities, symbolic practices, which is around representation, kind of ideas that circulate within the world, and then affective practices. So I'm really interested in how emotion is a vehicle for how power travels in institutional spaces. So hopefully all of this will start making sense when we look at how this works in relation to masculinity specifically, when we start getting into the data. So yeah, I'm interested in kind of the way in which social norms work to systematize kind of power. So the relationship between social norms and power as an institutional or a practice of institutionalization. So I'm interested in systems, but I understand them as being dynamic, populated by people, and actually created by the people that we see in those institutional spaces. So power then and institutional spaces are things that we're all in together, we all participate in, we all often gain from, but we all also suffer within. So we'll see a little bit again through the data kind of what I mean by that. So but in relation to those institutional spaces, we're all positioned very differently. So our different positionings are actually what make up the patterning of the kind of cultural, social, formal institutional spaces that are kind of patterned. So I'm interested in that dynamic and how different people and their positionings work together to create the patterning of a space. So that's something we're going to look at through the data. So as an example, or to kind of give you a bit more of a sense of what I mean by that, masculinity then as a kind of set of embodied practices, or femininity for me as a woman, doesn't necessarily work in the same way in the university, for example, as it might in a prison context. And I've done work in both of those contexts to kind of explore how our positionings work. So from my point of view, the work that I talk about in that most recent book, Power, Politics and the Emotions, is really about public service kind of forms of masculinity. So I work in health services, in education services, in social services. Some of the people that you'll meet through my data are working in. So I have worked a lot with kind of public sector professionals, men, women, of all sorts of kind of different relationships to kind of institutional power. So I'm trying to keep an eye on time so that I don't go too much over 35, 40 minutes absolute max. But I'll just give you a sense of the kind of key themes in that book overall, because although I'm going to look at chapter 4, this issue of masculinity and its relationship to whiteness, is one of the key themes that kind of carries throughout the book. So the book starts off really by positioning itself as interested in looking at what many people have been talking about in terms of institutional whiteness. So institutional whiteness is fundamental to the kind of codifying and framing of broader institutional power in the British context, and also in the context of the global north, and actually globally more broadly. I won't be talking about that today, but that's something that relates to the analysis that I develop in the book. So institutional power then, and institutional masculinities as a way of doing power in institutional spaces is a form of white power, is basically what I'm arguing. But I don't understand whiteness as necessarily something natural to only certain bodies, and hopefully I think that will become clearer again through my kind of exposition of the data that I'm going to talk to you about. So contemporary institutional practices then work through expressions of good or proper ways to behave in organisational spaces. So these practices of institutional whiteness are codified through our ideas of what it is to be like a proper professional in institutional spaces, how we do professionalism in a good kind of way. So there's a code that's operating there that isn't always open, that actually is a code for whiteness and a code for certain forms of masculinities. So professional values, professional ideals, even the kind of trappings of certain professionals, the stethoscope, the white coat, those sorts of things for medics, kind of carry values and power with them that are related to kind of how we see people and how we understand them operating within the world, and the power or not that they hold in different kind of positions. So it relies on on that sort of institutional whiteness then relies on establishing older versions of problematic practices which are related to particular forms of masculinity. So this intersection between whiteness and masculinity works through the problematic positioning of certain individuals as doing like old practices in institutional spaces. So this is kind of a summary of what the data is going to draw out for you. And these sorts of practices then are collectively established in institutional spaces. So while we all operate as individuals in our working lives, in our cultural lives, as friends, as, you know, kind of mothers, as fathers, our positionings and the way in which we become raised and gendered, so my identity as a white woman is not only something that I establish on my own. It's not natural to me. It's something that gets produced through my interactions with other people. So that's really what I'm going to unpack today then. Okay, so sorry, I said I was going to move through the slides, didn't I? So we're on number 4 now. So just giving an overview of today's session then very briefly. Firstly, I'm going to contextualise issues of kind of masculinity and the constructions of masculinity as dichotomous in terms of black and white. And I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of that's culturally dichotomous, so not literally. I'm then going to think about about men and masculinities and how we feel about them in the context of popular culture now. So I'm going to look and think about kind of contemporary masculine anxieties or anxieties we have as a culture about masculinity, because that plays in important ways to what I'm going to kind of talk to you about. And then finally, I'm really just going to get into the meat of the example, and hopefully you'll be able to, it will kind of prompt some discussion with you all, and then think about the implications of the example. So I want to show really through some of the data that I use in my analysis in the book that I've just talked to you a little bit about, how this stuff actually works. So how collective practices come together to produce particular institutional narratives around masculinity. And those narratives matter because they impact on how we see individual men and women in all sorts of different institutional locations. So they impact on how people get treated, what sort of care they get, whether they end up in prison, whether they don't, all of these sorts of things. So I'm interested in looking at how that stuff actually works in practice, how it comes to be, you might say, from a more sociological kind of perspective. Okay? So I'm used to clicking on my slides. So I'm moved on to my next slide now. So Section 1 then. So what I talked just a little minute ago about these two different ideas about masculinity that we kind of have socially. So when we talk about masculinity as relational, we are often thinking about the way in which blackness, or certainly racially relational, we are often talking about the way, or it's common for sociologists anyway, to talk about the way in which whiteness and blackness are not understandable out of that context of the relationship between the two. So we only understand people as being white or black if we have the other kind of comparator position in our minds to understand. So we don't kind of pop out of our mother's wombs understanding people as kind of black and white, or as men and women indeed. Those are social constructions that get built up kind of over time. And when we talk about those as being relational, we talk about them as happening like together, as only making sense with one in relation to the other. So I'm really interested in the way in which we can start to think about that in more complicated ways. And we have started to in Remy's work. You'll have already heard really interesting stuff from him, which really starts to trouble that relational kind of a simplified anyway relational dynamic between black and white, kind of what we would think about as a dichotomy. But I'm really interested because culturally these dichotomies still have a lot of sway, and there's been, to kind of give you an example of what I might mean when I mean, we kind of think about people as black and white and have codified sets of ideas that sit behind those. I'm giving you these two examples here of the 56 black men kind of campaign that I'm guessing many of you have probably heard about. I think this is really interesting, this very recent kind of campaign that's actually been driven by black men themselves to challenge kind of cultural perceptions of who they are and what it is that they represent, and how that relates to or doesn't relate to the complexities of being a black man in the contemporary kind of culture. So I think this is really interesting, this campaign in particular, with the hoodies, because it hooks into common stereotypes, but what it also really starts to very directly challenge in relation to the contemporary kind of cultural situation and moment that we're in is the way that relates back to historical constructions of black masculinity. So for me, I love that campaign because it really brings that to the fore. So some of the references that I've put there on your slide. So for instance, Paul Gilroy's work, Errol Lawrence's work, right back in the early 80s, actually prior to that, the late 70s, members of the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, where I did my kind of first degrees, were writing really interesting stuff about the way in which the pathologisation of black family life and black masculinities in relation to that kind of creates a stage for constructing black men through ideas of criminality, loutishness, all of this kind of common ideas that we have around problematic black masculinity. So I really love that campaign because it very directly brings right into our kind of everyday knowledge, like conversations, a challenge, a really explicit challenge to that construction of masculinity, which quite obviously is still there and still experienced. You'll have already discussed this ad infinitum, I'm sure. On the right-hand side, though, you've got these images of cultural constructions of white masculinity, of course, which are counterposed. So you've almost got these two kind of like really counterposed ideals. And of course, you've got lots of things in between, which also I'm sure you will have talked about. But these two kind of counterposed ideals, which relate to or which underpin the ideal kind of construction of white masculinities. So Richard Dyer's work was very important in the early 2000s to really shedding a light on how white masculinities were understood within kind of Western cultures and how that related to historical ideas, again, of colonialism, coloniality, so how they got lived. But so whiteness, white masculinity is rooted in kind of these ideas of the hero, decisiveness, enterprise, kind of control of the self and others around them. So you've got John Wayne here, who in filmic kind of representation, at least at one point, the kind of 50s, 60s, was really, really a very good example of that kind of masculine ideal, the white saviour bloke, I suppose. I've deliberately put this guy down at the right-hand side, this business guy at the moment, because, there's been a lot of work done since Richard Dyer's work, which considers how white masculinities work within the professional sphere. So how these kind of ideas of heroism, decisiveness, enterprise, control move into our institutional spaces. So Richard Dyer's work looked explicitly at kind of the media, but there is a lot of other work that has shifted that analysis into like general day-to-day kind of institutional spaces. So masculinity from these different kind of points of view is material, symbolic, and affective. So it kind of works on these three levels that I talked about at the beginning when I kind of introduced my work. So it relates to material practices, so like who has what money, how they look after their bodies, literally the practicalities of our bodies. It has symbolic value in terms of, you know, these are symbols, they are representations, so they have visual, oral kind of cultural meaning, and they are also affective. Now there's less work done around, or certainly less work done in those kind of in that earlier work around what the affects, what the emotions attached to these stereotypes or these kind of ideal positions, or non-ideal actually is what we're talking about, isn't it, because they're problematic, but they work as social ideals, as kind of measurements of value. So they have particular emotional kind of ideals attached to them. So white masculinities, calmness, kind of even-handedness, or straightforwardness, straight talking, you know. For black masculinity in that kind of form that it's being depicted, and that the 56 Black Men campaign are resisting, you know, absolutely traditional things in relation to anger, violence, all of those sorts of things that are associated with black masculinities. So kind of very counterposed. Okay, so I'm moving on to the next slide now, because you know, I've hinted already at the various ways in which that's troubled. Those two kind of counterpositions of masculinities are troubled. And you will already have thought through these ideas of mixedness and looked at the relationship between these two and multiple ideals, I guess, in relation to Remy's work around masculinities and mixednesses, and how that works as a set of lived practices in all sorts of different contexts. You'll have had a discussion about that. I suppose part of what I don't know is whether you'll have troubled that in the sorts of ways that I would like to in relation to thinking about masculine anxieties. So you might have done a bit of this already, or this might be kind of complementary, or even speak back to in a different way. But so those different ways of thinking about masculinities, and in particular those ideals of the right sort of masculinity as being the calm, kind of controlled one, the one that can control everybody else, can lead them, have really started to be really explicitly troubled within our popular kind of culture and our mainstream culture very recently again. I think this recent troubling, from my point of view as somebody who's done work in this area for the last 20 or so years, this is really interesting, and also as a feminist. So, you know, we've got lots of discussion around ideas of toxic masculinities, how problematic certain forms of these kind of heroic, controlling of self and of other, dominating masculinities, because in a way those kind of white ideals relate to ideals of domination, maybe soft domination, but actually we know through the kind of ways in which domination works, even as a soft tool of power, it actually becomes a very violent and violating form of domination. So some of the kind of troubles in our contemporary culture that we've been having around those things relate to this recognition between masculine, softer masculine domination and how it actually pans out in practice as really quite violating. So we've got, you know, very obviously the Me Too kind of campaigns that have come up over the last few years, you know, and I don't even need to really kind of go into that. That's absolutely everywhere on the news, on all sorts of different contexts, almost every day at the moment in some way or other. This image that I've got here is really interesting because it's this new organisation information that I hadn't actually heard of until I was thinking about kind of what I was going to talk to you about today, and was doing a little bit of a search to see, what the crack was at the moment, what's going on. In the context of the sorts of things I wanted to talk to you about, renewing my images, I suppose. So I was looking at, I found the Better Men conference, which has been established by this guy in the picture. So this Better Man conference is a conference kind of that is explicitly set up to create safe spaces for men to kind of come and engage around these issues. What is it to be a better man in the context of the sorts of things that we're now recognising work in terms of masculine kind of ways of working in institutions. So what's very interesting for me is the sorts of anxieties that we're expressing in culture were being expressed by the participants that I was doing interviews with nearly 20 years ago now. So I think the interviews that some of them in the book were conducted in the 2000s, very early 2000s. And it's very interesting to me that so many people are becoming interested again and in different ways in that work, really. And actually there's probably more interest in that aspect of my work now than there has been over kind of most of my career, I guess. So I'm just going to read some of the data from George's account first, so that you get a sense of how men were talking about their masculinities explicitly, their masculine identities, and kind of how masculinity, being a man, impacted on their working life. So this comes from George. You've got the data again in front of you, but I'm going to take some time to read it. So in response to me asking about how masculinity works for George at work in his institutional context, he's a white male manager within a social services department. He's the manager of that department, and he's 52 at the time we were interviewing. I was 21, which I think is very interesting, actually, and that there's definitely some work to do there on all of the stuff that I've kind of been looking at over the last while. So I was a lot younger than I am now. So there are times when I've had to reflect on those sorts of categorisations, so gender and ethnicity, and I'm asking him about his gender and his ethnicity here, so I think this is interesting too. In a way, and he focuses on his masculinity, completely erases his whiteness in this kind of context. This, we'll discuss this in relation to the group data in a minute, or you'll discuss it and I'll kind of talk you through it. So in a way, yes, I have to think about it. In my working relationships, in terms of, maybe a female colleague, and I can't necessarily that clearly pin down, so he starts whispering. It's a theme that runs through surfaces at different times with people. I mean, sometimes with some people it's much more acute for some reason than with other people. With other people I scarcely notice that we're a different gender, but with some people there are things that somehow bring us back to the forefront time and time again. So I say to George, can you think about an example? Yes, I can, he says. But it'll be, the reasons for that will remain concealed. I may at various points speculate as to what it is, but unless a person chooses to share what might be very intimate stuff, I'll never actually know what is it that makes the gender thing a live thing between us, I can think of one, maybe two relationships like that where I know it is an issue, but I quite often can't put my finger on what it is because it's locked. Like, I don't know, I can't really define what it is. I know I'm being very much defined in my gender, in my sort of maleness, and I have a quite strong sense of that. So, why I wanted to read that at length and why I wanted to kind of bring that to you, I suppose, was for me that's a really interesting example of the ways in which it's so difficult to get at how gender works for all of us, but often for men for people who are positioned through their masculinity in institutional context, because masculinity is a much more institutionally ready identity than than womanhood is, or certainly used to be. And definitely, again, we're talking like 20 years ago. This stuff was a little bit different then, although there are very obvious similarities. So for me, we kind of get the sense of how gender's embodied, it's elusive, it's kind of in there, it's not in there, it's kind of there, but nobody can really explain it, and it's troubled. There's something in the way that George is talking about this, in the way he's kind of struggling to articulate it, something that's not kind of quite working here, and we'll see that very explicitly in the kind of group data that I'm going to consider. So, the next slide is really a kind of summary slide that gives you a bit of a sense of how I've been starting to think about the way in which masculinity, these different masculinities were working in institutional spaces, with explicit reference to the interrelationship between white workers in the institutional space, so white women and white men. So you'll see the data that I'm going to talk about troubles this more because it brings in different voices. But one of the things that this troubled anxiety around kind of masculinity in particular can be or one of the ways of understanding that is through ideas of shame, and how shame and kind of feeling ashamed of something about ourselves that we can't quite put our fingers on manifests in the everyday, in relation to these kind of broader difficulties of articulating ourselves and our relationship to others, the uneasiness it brings to our institutional life, but the kind of, it's really difficult to articulate, but there's something there that is a problem, that is producing a kind of barrier. And I think we can think about that in emotional terms in relation to shame. Now, there's a big kind of broader argument around this. What I've decided to do now, because I've kind of used aspects of these slides, I'm going to pass on the paper where I talk about this white benevolent institutional ideal, which is important in the shift we've seen in institutional spaces. So I'm going to pass that on to Michael so that he can pass that round, and you can kind of engage with that if you want. That work isn't in the book. It relates to the book, but it's not in the book explicitly. So I think it's worth me passing that on. I think it's easier, yes, in terms of passing on the actual article. Okay, so we've been used to then, in the past, thinking about the way in which, or we've started to think much more explicitly about the way in which hypermasculinities, toxic masculinities, are problematic and shameful kind of manifestations in the institutional context. So for those positioned through white masculinity, we've got this picture of the white worried man. The white worried man is very often circulating in institutional spaces, certainly now, all over the internet, all over LinkedIn. If any of you are in LinkedIn, there's a lot of white worried men out there on LinkedIn, as there are in all sorts of kind of institutional contexts. So this figure of the white worried man is kind of a contemporary way of doing a form of white masculinity which shows that we're worried about those past practices. We want to do something about them. We know they were wrong, and we know they were producing inequalities. So you've then got the white worried women, maybe like me, certainly positioned in the sort of way that I am. So you might look at me sometimes as a white worried woman, who is also worried about these masculine practices, very upset and disempowered by them sometimes, but I work in a particular relationship to white worried men, and I can work as a way of policing white men's bad behaviours in institutional spaces. So what I'm interested in kind of drawing our attention to there is the way in which these constructions of problematic old practices, these hypermasculine practices, we get these figures, these new institutional figures that are still often enacted through whiteness or related to whiteness. So you get white men worried about old, bad white practices, and you get that were associated with old ways of doing masculinity, these kind of hyper masculine kind of success, control ideals, all of these things, and all of the kind of embodied practices that come with those. And then you also get white women saviours who are working in institutional spaces to help out these white worried men to kind of shift and get rid of their institutionally kind of bad practices that relate to hypermasculinity. So I'm interested in that dynamic, partly because it centralises the relationship between problematic masculinities and whiteness still. So when we think about who is it that comes in to do the shifting of these bad, toxic masculine practices, who gets allowed to do that shifting and that challenging, it's sometimes white men, but also very often white women. And I think the example of the Me Too campaign is really interesting there, because that was a campaign that wasn't started by white women. It was started way back in 2006 by black women who had experienced sexual violence, and they were challenging this. Now, that narrative around the Me Too campaign has largely disappeared, and I think that relates to all of these kind of dynamics that I'm interested in thinking about. So I said I was going to give us a couple of theoretical ideas to kind of think through this stuff, and how it relates to how we all work together to produce what I'm thinking of in terms of these white masculinities, black masculinities, actually white femininities. So none of them comes about on their own. They're all interdependent and dependent on one another for meaning. Okay, so the cultural representations as they attach to the individuals are all interdependently created, so co-created. And that's what I want to show through the next few slides after I talk to you a little bit about Michael Omi and Howard Winant's work on racial formation. So my work builds on ideas of racial formation in quite significant ways, but I still think that this is one of the most helpful ways I have of communicating this idea of racial formation, about how race is a dynamic process, the same way that masculinity is a dynamic and intersectional process. So all of these things work together. The intersectionality aspect is the bit that I've been building on for the last however long, and which we see in the dialogue. But the dynamics of a racial formation, Michael Omi and Howard Winant describe beautifully in the first attempts in the late 70s, early 80s, and then later on the second edition is what I'm quoting from here. So this is what they say of his big long book, great stuff, all around the US kind of context though, so be careful with that one if you're reading it. But this is what they say about the theory of racial formation. So the theory of racial formation suggests that society is suffused with racial projects, large and small, to which all are subjected, so all of us. This racial subjection is quintessentially ideological. Everybody learns some combination, some version of the rules of classification and of his or her own racial identity, often without obvious teaching or without conscious inculcation. So this is an ideological process that we do not notice is happening. It frames, even down to our bodies, our sense of self. And that was what I was trying to get at when we were thinking about what George was saying there. So race, all of the names, I should say, they're all pseudonyms. So I wouldn't even remember what George's name was now if I met him in the street and recognised him from 20 years ago, because I use the pseudonyms so readily now, so that's just to be clear about that. So race becomes common sense, a way of comprehending, explaining and acting in the world, a vast web or racial a vast web of racial projects mediates between the discursive or representational means in which race is identified and signified on the one hand, and the institutional and organisational forms in which it's routinized and standardized on the other. And this is what I'm kind of looking at, where these two come together in the data. These projects are at the heart of the racial formation process. So, what I'm going to do then, taking you through the data, just for the last kind of, hopefully 7 or 8 minutes maximum, is really I'm looking at how an institutional formation kind of, or a collective group formation, actually this is really about profession and the health services and how that's working in the example I'm using, trace the way race actually works at the symbolic level, how it has practical effects through its symbolic kind of manifestations. So how race attaches to supposedly neutral ideas and practices like profession, and by tracing how working in action, or how looking at how race works in action, we can get to the why of race. So this tells us something about the why of the intersection between race and gender and how they intersect. So looking at how something works tells us about the why, and that's why I think this is kind of so powerful in a way. So the narrative I'm going to talk to you about, I kind of title it as "We'd all be equal if it weren't for those old Asian GPs." Asian men GPs, so general practitioners there. So what I'm interested in doing is taking you through now the data that is kind of put together as a dialogue in the chapter form that you will get to read. Or you can read if you want to, because it's quite heavy going, that chapter. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of other theoretical kind of work that I'm doing in the book. This is me kind of taking out one particular set of arguments. So it's heavy going, possibly, or you might love it. It might be the most interesting thing you've ever read. Okay, so, but let's see. Anyway, so positioning as a creative process is what I'm really interested in. I'm going to take you through the data and look at how race and masculinity are circulating in an institutional context via ideas of profession. So that's what I'm interested in, or how I show you how race works in a codified way and how it intersects with masculinity and how it's interdependent on multiple different positionings. So, okay then. So the first slide I've got here, what I've done with the data is this slide, you've got a meaty piece of data because it's important positioning-wise for the whole of the dialogue, the meaning in the dialogue. But then the next 2 slides, what I've done is truncated the meaning from the larger bits of data so that you can see the dynamic way in which the conversation develops. And then I've got a diagram that shows you how the social and the group kind of dynamics are working, so in diagrammatic form in that institutional space. So that's like it's a less heavy, less detailed way of thinking about the data, but the actual data, the broader data and the much deeper interpretation is in chapter 4 of the book if you want to kind of read that and are interested in that. So, and these people are all people who have been involved in what way now preceded community commissioning groups, so CCGs they're called now. This is like 2 iterations ago in the early 2000s we're looking at. So these were organisations that were primary care groups moving to primary care trusts in the context of the National Health Service. So all of these people are people that work within the health services. Obviously in that context we've got the domination of medicine still and general practice, largely in relation to the health services kind of space. So we've got nurses who work in the community here, we've got social workers who were involved in developing work with the primary care groups and trust, we've got managers, we've got nurse managers, we've got CEOs, and we've got many medics, as you'll see, many GPs. So all of these folks are involved in the dialogue, and the dialogue is ostensibly about profession, but it tells us all sorts of things about race and gender and how that works to construct professional ideals, and particularly these ideals of benevolence So how do we work as equal, nice, good professionals in the contemporary institutional space? And how do we explain all these bad practices in relation to that are going on? Or, well, that's located with a set of people that get constructed on the outside of this dialogue. Okay, so I'm going to start off with Sam, who is a white male GP, also 52 at the time that I was interviewing him. So I asked him about, like, first, how did you get to be here now? You know, how did you get to be this person working in this space? So he's a GP working in general practice and then working in the PCG. And he starts off his interview with me in response to that question here. I did a year in Africa. There, the hospital was run very much by the doctors, medical directors, a team of about 10 doctors, nearly all expatriate, either Indian or British expatriate doctors. There was one female doctor, mostly male, but of course the doctors were such a different breed there, training, different background to everyone else, that it was very much one team, I think. The funny thing is, compared with the National Health Service, job satisfaction seemed to be higher, because it was doctors were totally in control of the entire system from top to bottom. And things that you can't do here, you could do there. So you ran the whole system, top to bottom, and all the rules, which meant you were doing fewer things that you thought were stupid. Any rule that affected the way doctors did their jobs in Africa, the decision had been made by a group of doctors quite reasonably. And that meant that even the things you disagreed with, you could see that it was a decision that had been made for a reasonable reason, you know, a sensible reason. In the health service, there are all kinds of things that are irrational, stupid. For example, if someone needs to stay on medication for a year, they only need checking every 6 months. They've got to come back here to me for me to write a prescription, blah, blah, blah. So he's kind of complaining about this issue. So we've got a feeling, he says, of being disempowered, if you like, on a professional level. So why I took some time to read that is because what it does is it positions ideas of profession in the context of the English National Health Service, which is what I was talking to this guy about when I met him. I didn't say I'm really interested in your travel overseas and abroad and how that's impacted your working life at all. Nothing to do with that. This is how we started. He initially very strongly set up a racial dynamic, which was a historical comparison for him, which related to his life, when he trained, as a lot of medics do still in our current context, certainly at that point, were training overseas. So they'd go and do a year in Africa. You'd meet people that had done a year in Israel, all of this sort of training in other international contexts that usually had colonial links in some way to the English context. So, but that establishes race as connected to profession in the context of the dialogue. So, what I want to do now is just go through the structure of this dialogue so that you get a sense of the different ways in which people were responding to this initial construction and how it then frames what gets discussed in the dialogue around profession. So, we start off then, and as I say, the broader data sets are all contained in the book. I'm mindful of time now, so I'm really going to wrap up very quickly within the next 3 minutes, says Shona. Okay, so Sam says then, in this irrational NHS, we're GPs, we're feeling disempowered, we're losing our dominance, effectively, is what he's talking about there. Ian then comes in, he's another white male GP 39, but we're not really dominant, he says, are we? Sam comes back at him. I want us GPs to be seen as the hard men, he says, and he used all of the words that I'm using here are words that are used in the data. I want us to be seen as the hard men. Navneen then comes into the dialogue. So Navneen is an Asian male. All the ethnic and gendered descriptors relate to the ways in which participants were positioning themselves. So either through whiteness and then in relation to ethnicity, that became more complicated, but they're related to self-definition. So Navneen, Asian male GP of 42, he is 42. Remember that because it's important for later. But we work differently now, he says. It's the change brought by women's entrance into medical decision making. So that's so threatening to you older male GPs, he says, Navneen says. So he sets up this kind of different positioning between different sets of GPs. So it's lots of GPs kind of coming in, not really sure, how do we work, what's going on in relation to dominance. Ian then says, it's a shame, he says, that things are changing so much. There won't be enough men doing the job, he says. Navneen comes in again. It's the old GPs that are the problem. So he's really like, these old guys, they're really the problem for us. They are so threatened, always threatened. Bill, a white middle class chief executive of one of these PCTs, 50, he says the reality's different. They still have lots of power. They're always in my way, he says. So this is another white male protagonist in the dialogue. Rita then comes in. She's a British Asian woman who is, within the context of health services management, that was very unusual at that point, 34 years old, so really kind of quite high up within the NHS hierarchy at a very young age. So British Asian woman. You get hung if you challenge, she says. Bill, it's still macho, worrying, very worrying. I find it embarrassing. So there's like an expression of this worry, isn't there? You know, this worry of this overhang, this something that's still back there, this bad masculinity. So the dialogue, I've moved on to the next slide now, then starts shifting. So we've got this positioning of these problematic old male GPs. Everybody's kind of, apart from Sam, in some sort of contention that different positionings, but basically they're what's causing the problem in relation to all sorts of things in the health services currently. And it's a relatively kind of middle-aged Asian male GP that very explicitly establishes that old, young kind of dynamic, which is interesting. So then we move on in the dialogue. Maureen then comes in. She's a white woman CEO who's 47. She says, you have to work hard to be accepted by GPs into the family. Shona, I ask, is it about being a clinician then? Is that what's going on here? So I want to bring them back. I want to check out, how is it we're talking about profession, but you guys are all talking about something else that's to do with masculinity and potentially starts to shift at this point. So I check it out. And Maureen says, I'm not sure. You have to work really hard to be accepted as a woman by Asian GPs. And as a nurse, it's difficult too. So there's a shift that then gets taken up by the rest of the group. Jane says, you have to do so much to be listened to. It's a power thing. They won't sit back and listen. I know as a woman it's so hard. So gender's starting to surface in quite interesting ways here. Lucy then comes in, another white woman, differently positioned again in relation to management, nurse management, senior again within the context of the PCT. That's still hanging on, that older male mode. Lydia, another nurse manager again, high up in the context of the PCT, the organisation basically. With some of the older Asian male doctors, it's a cultural, rigid, hierarchical, like the British Empire, sterile, dictatorial, and viewing nurses and women in the wrong way. Now, I've written in a lot of detail elsewhere about Lydia. Lydia was actually married to an Asian male GP at the time of these interviews and still now, I presume. So I think that's very interesting in terms of how masculinity gets constructed through femininity and different kind of family and intimate relationships. George then comes in. This is the same George we heard from right at the beginning of my talk. I've been staggered, he says, by their attitude, especially the Asian male GPs. Puzzled. Feels a real overhang, really rude. What the hell's going on here? Just really rude to each other. Have head-on clashes. Okay, so very briefly then to wrap up. What is really interesting there and what I'm trying to draw our attention to is the way in which masculinity isn't singular in that narrative. It's not always problematic. Certain sorts of masculinity is positioned as problematic, and the problematic positioning only works because multiple different sets of people who are positioned differently in relation to that start to come together to create what I think about as this intersecting racial masculine kind of formation. So what is it that we think of when we think of institutional masculinities and how they work, and that only works through or is created through the co-construction between these differently positioned people, for which those masculinities are still all potentially problematic. Okay, so the slide that I come on to next gives you a diagrammatic kind of image of that. So why does this matter then, to wrap up? Why, does all of this stuff matter? So what it tells us is that there are a set of substantive issues that are working here in institutions where masculinity and its intersections with race and other issues of generation are concerned. So acts of seeing through inequality, of recognising it, of knowing it. So we can see power dynamics. Power dynamics are being critiqued here, and masculine power dynamics in particular. But I'm really interested because what happens is the way in which that gets named works like as an act of transcendence. So the naming of something that's a problem actually starts to work to position everyone else as outside of the problem. Okay, so all of the people there's nobody in the dialogue that goes, hey, I'm a problem. They're all, he's a problem, she's a problem, they're a problem, this is a problem. That's how that works from different perspectives. So these acts of seeing or recognising are codified. So the moments at which bad whiteness or bad masculinity in this case is most visible, and of course these things intersect, but the whiteness is completely codified. Through its absence in a way. So masculinity comes to stand in for an awful lot of set of other features, right, that are being assumed and attached to it. It's most visibilised are the moments in which whiteness is working as a form and masculinity is working as a form of power and domination. So the moments at which something is being identified as problematic is often the point at which it is working hardest to maintain itself as a relation of domination. And I think that's really interesting when we think about how do we tackle this stuff. And it's complicated and it's problematic and it makes it really hard work. So it also shows us the collective process. That was really what I was interested in. So you can't be a man, a problematic man, a good woman, any of these things on your own. Other people have to take up position in relation to that set of meaning. And that becomes really important when we think about doing anti-racist work or equalities work or dealing with problematic masculine practices, problematic feminine practices, whatever we're interested in challenging. And at the individual level, there are a set of very serious psychic costs for all of the people involved in that dialogue, I would suggest, and all of us who are being positioned in these ways. And those psychic costs are the ones that we very, very rarely consider how to kind of resolve in institutional life. So I'm going to leave that with you. Hopefully, Maxine and Michael will be able to kind of assist in, I don't know, you guys all of engaging with that. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I realise I've gone a lot longer than I should have done, so Michael might have chopped me off or given you a break halfway through. Anyway, thank you. Yes, and sorry I couldn't be there to kind of engage in the discussion because that would have been much more interesting than listening to myself or speaking to myself. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day. Bye.